The carriage creaked to a stop at the edge of the mountain path, its wheels sinking slightly into the damp earth. Leah sat still, her hands locked around a small velvet pouch pressed tight against her ribs. The driver, an older man with a sunken face, did not look at her as he opened the door. She stepped down, her worn shoes slipping on the muddy stones. A thin fog curled around her ankles, rising slowly to swallow the outline of the narrow hospice ahead. The building looked like a large gray lung, heavy and unmoving, with shuttered windows and a single unlit lantern hanging crooked above the entrance. A tall woman waited by the door, her posture straight, her hair pulled into a severe bun. Her face was a pale blade under the morning light, showing neither warmth nor impatience. She did not greet Leah with words, only a curt nod that felt more like a command than a welcome. Leah hesitated, her breath trembling in the cold air. The velvet pouch pulsed under her fingers, a small heartbeat that reminded her why she had come, or rather why she had been sent. Behind her the carriage door slammed shut, and the driver climbed back onto his seat without a backward glance. The horse whinnied softly, as if in protest, before the whole cart turned and disappeared into the fog. Left alone, Leah felt her knees weaken. The woman at the door stepped forward, grasping her arm firmly. Her grip was dry, strong like bone. Leah staggered but did not resist. The woman guided her up the 3 crooked steps, past the lantern, into the shadowed entryway. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The walls were lined with faded portraits, each face severe and unblinking. The floor creaked under each step, echoing as though the house itself was listening. Leah's eyes darted to a closed door at the end of the hall, its handle wrapped in a strip of black cloth. They stopped before a narrow staircase leading upward into darkness. The woman finally spoke, her voice low and iron-flat. "You will stay quiet," she said. "There is no need for questions here." Leah opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The woman turned and began climbing the stairs without waiting for her. Leah followed, clutching the pouch tighter than ever, her breath shallow, her steps hesitant. Each creak of the wood beneath her feet felt like a tiny confession she could not control. At the top of the stairs, the woman paused by a narrow door, unlocking it with a heavy brass key. She pushed it open and stepped aside, revealing a small, cold room with a single narrow bed and a wooden chair under a fogged window. Leah entered, feeling the walls close around her. The woman did not follow. She shut the door with a quiet finality, and the key turned with a single, sharp click. In the sudden silence, Leah pressed her forehead against the window pane. Outside, the fog shifted and twisted like pale hands. The pouch trembled in her hands, heavy with its secret. She did not cry. Instead, she let the chill of the glass seep into her bones, a numbness she already knew she would need to survive whatever waited behind the other doors in this house. The morning light did not reach Leah's room. When she opened her eyes, she found the window covered in a thick layer of mist, as if the entire mountain had swallowed the sun. Her fingers were numb from gripping the velvet pouch all night, her mind echoing with the heavy click of the lock from the night before. A slow, deliberate knock broke the silence. Before she could answer, the door swung open. Madame Rowe entered, carrying a small basin of water and a folded gray dress. She placed them on the wooden chair without a glance at Leah. "You will wash quickly," Madame said, her voice flat and final. "Afterward, you will come downstairs to begin work." Leah remained on the edge of the bed, her lips parted in hesitation. Madame turned sharply, her gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "There is no talking unless I ask," she added. "No leaving your room after dusk. No entering the cellar, attic, or west corridor. Meals are at the bell. You are not to approach the gate alone. And—" She paused, her eyes sliding to the pouch. "You keep that hidden. It belongs to you now and no one else must see." Leah felt a sudden coldness fill her chest, as though her lungs had turned to stone. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she even knew why she obeyed. Madame studied her for a long moment, as if searching for a hidden crack in her resolve. Finally, Madame turned and left, shutting the door behind her with a quiet click that sounded louder than any scream. Leah slipped off the bed, her bare feet stinging against the cold floorboards. She washed quickly, trembling under the weight of the house's silence. The new dress felt coarse against her skin, the gray fabric swallowing her shape. She hid the pouch beneath the dress, close against her ribs. Downstairs, the hallway was narrow and dark. Leah's eyes darted to the portraits lining the walls. Men and women with sharp, distant faces, their gazes frozen in some private accusation. She felt each step echo inside her bones. At the end of the hall, Madame waited beside a long wooden table. An empty sewing basket and a stack of torn linens sat nearby. Madame pointed to the basket without a word. Leah lowered her head and stepped forward, her hands already aching at the thought of the hours ahead. As she began to sort the fabric, Madame hovered nearby, her breath a constant invisible blade against Leah's neck, the rules pressed against her mind like iron bars, no questions, no wandering, no sound after dusk. In that moment, Leah realized the hospice was not a place to heal. It was a cage, and she had already begun to disappear inside it. Leah's fingers moved stiffly over the torn linens, her skin roughening with each pull of the thread. The room smelled faintly of damp wood and stale soap. Every small sound, the clink of scissors, the sigh of fabric, felt sharp against the heavy silence. She kept her eyes lowered, but she felt them long before she saw them. The others. Two elderly workers moved around the edges of the room like shadows, their faces thin and waxy, eyes clouded as if they'd long forgotten sunlight. Their hands moved with mechanical precision, folding sheets, scrubbing stains from old garments. Neither looked up when Leah entered, and neither acknowledged her now. Then there was the girl. She sat at the far end of the table, her pale hands clutching a small pile of mending work. Her hair was a muted brown, tied tightly at the back of her neck. Her shoulders hunched forward, and her thin dress seemed to swallow her completely. Leah risked a glance, expecting to meet her eyes, but the girl's gaze was fixed on the torn cloth in front of her, unwavering. For a moment, Leah thought she saw the girl's lips move in a silent whisper. But before she could be sure, Madame Rowe's footsteps echoed in the corridor, sharp and deliberate. The girl flinched so hard she nearly dropped her sewing. Leah felt her own breath catch, a quick shiver crawling up her spine. Madame entered with a new stack of fabric and placed it harshly on the table. Her eyes swept over the room like a lantern in the dark, stopping on each worker one by one. "Faster!" she snapped. Her voice felt too loud for the small space, each syllable sinking into the walls. Leah lowered her head again, her fingers stumbling on a knot. Across the table, the girl's hands trembled for a moment before she forced them still. The elderly workers did not even pause. They kept moving as though nothing had happened, as though they did not hear or feel anything anymore. In that moment, Leah realized these people were not just workers or residents. They were pieces of the house itself, silent, obedient, nearly invisible. As the hours dragged on, Leah found her thoughts slipping inward. Each stitch felt like a tiny chain tightening around her ribs. When the bell finally rang for the midday meal, her hands were raw and her neck stiff. Madame Rowe led them all into the narrow dining room. There was no conversation, only the scrape of spoons against thin wooden bowls. The girl sat opposite Leah but never looked up. Leah watched her shoulders twitch each time Madame passed behind her. When the meal ended, they filed back into the workroom without a word. Leah felt her pouch shift beneath her dress, a small, secret weight against her heart. She thought she saw a question in the girl's lowered eyes, a flicker of something waiting to surface. But before Leah could hold on to it, the girl turned away, her shoulders collapsing inward once more. The days inside the hospice bled into one another, gray and soft-edged like the fog that pressed against the windows. Leah lost track of time, measuring hours only by the dull ring of the meal bell and the sting in her fingers. At night, the house became a different creature. The walls seemed to breathe. Floorboards creaked as if someone walked unseen in the halls. Leah often pressed her ear against her door, listening. One night she heard it clearly. Madame Rowe's slow, deliberate steps moving past her room. Then a pause. A soft clink of keys. The door at the end of the corridor opening. A draft of cold air slipping under Leah's door like a warning. When morning returned, the fog outside looked thicker than before, curling around the hospice like a living shroud. During work, Leah began to notice small details. The pale girl sometimes flinched at sounds no one else seemed to hear. The scrape of a chair, the snap of thread. Once when Madame Rose's sleeve brushed her shoulder, she recoiled as if burned. Leah's eyes followed Madame Rose when she moved around the room. The woman's presence seemed to stretch beyond her body, an invisible net thrown over everyone present. When she wasn't in the room, the workers' hands slowed, their shoulders lowered as if they could finally breathe. Leah studied the others carefully. The elderly man's knuckles were raw and scabbed. The older woman's hair was thin and brittle, her eyes sunken so deep it seemed she no longer saw anything. Above them all, portraits hung in a rigid line, faces staring down with cold permanence. Leah realized each face carried the same expression Madame wore. That dry, judging quiet. One afternoon, Leah was ordered to fetch a bundle of linens from a small storage room. As she entered the cramped space, the air shifted around her. She saw a pile of folded sheets in the corner, but something else caught her eye. A narrow crack in the floorboards near the far wall. Leah knelt, her fingers brushing the crack. She felt a faint draft rising through it, as if the house itself exhaled beneath her touch. Her heart quickened, but before she could look further, Madame Rose's voice sliced through the air behind her. "What are you doing?" Leah jolted upright, nearly dropping the linens. She turned to see Madame standing in the doorway, her pale eyes narrow and heavy with suspicion. "Just gathering the sheets," Leah managed to whisper. Madame stepped forward, took the linens from her arms, and guided her out with a cold hand on her back. The woman's fingers dug into Leah's spine with such force that she nearly stumbled. As she returned to her sewing station, Leah felt the others watching her, not with curiosity, but with an exhausted kind of pity. That night, Leah lay awake, her mind spiraling around the crack in the floor and the cold draft. She pressed the velvet pouch against her chest, feeling its secret weight echo in her bones. And outside her door, in the hallway swallowed by darkness, Madame Rose's lantern moved slowly back and forth, a restless, hungry eye. Leah spent the next day in a haze, her hands moving mechanically through each stitch and fold. The image of the crack in the floor haunted her mind like a flickering lantern in the dark. Each time she glanced up, she felt Madame Rose's cold gaze pressing against her skin, heavy and unblinking. That evening, as the meal bell rang, Leah forced herself to eat the thin broth without tasting it. Her fingers brushed the hidden pouch under her dress, grounding her in the moment. When Madame announced that night's curfew, the room went silent. The workers drifted upstairs like shadows, and soon Leah found herself alone in her small room, the walls closing in. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the fog outside her window. A slow, reckless pulse grew inside her, a sudden, trembling urge to move, to breathe different air. Her hand slid down to the floor, feeling for her worn shoes. She paused at the door, her ear pressed against the wood. No sound. Madame's footsteps were absent tonight, or so it seemed. Leah's breath faltered, her pulse loud in her skull. She pressed the latch slowly, inch by inch, until the door opened just enough for her to slip out. The hallway was darker than she had imagined. A single lantern glowed weakly at the far end, its light thin and shivering. Leah tiptoed past the sleeping rooms, past the old portraits whose eyes seemed to track her every step. She reached the kitchen door and pushed it open. The scent of cold ashes and stale bread washed over her. She stepped inside and felt a sharp relief, a taste of forbidden freedom. On the table lay a knife, its edge catching the lantern glow. Leah's hand hovered above it, her fingers twitching, but a sudden floorboard creaked behind her and she spun around, her breath locked in her throat. In the doorway stood Madame Rose. She held no lantern, no weapon, only her thin, skeletal hands clasped before her. For a moment they stared at each other in perfect silence. Then Madame stepped forward, her eyes dark and endless. She grabbed Leah's wrist in one swift motion and pulled her from the kitchen. Leah struggled, her feet slipping on the rough floor, but Madame's grip was iron. Without a word, Madame dragged her down the hallway, past the stairs of the portraits, past the narrow staircase, and shoved her into her room. The door slammed shut, and the key turned sharply in the lock. Leah crumpled to the floor, her wrist throbbing where Madame's fingers had dug deep, the pouch pressed against her ribs, a mute witness to her failure. In the darkness, Leah felt something new bloom inside her, a small, cold knot of fear that curled tighter with each breath. But beneath it, hidden and faint, another feeling flickered, a fragile ember of defiance that refused to die. Morning came heavy and gray, the fog thicker than ever. Leah lay curled on the narrow bed, her body tense and her wrists still burning with Madame Rose's bruising grip. She barely touched her breakfast when it was brought to her. Each spoonful felt like swallowing stones. When the work bell rang, she moved mechanically to the sewing room. Madame's presence weighed heavier than before, her eyes following Leah with every stitch, every breath. The pale girl avoided her gaze completely, her hands trembling more than usual. At midday, as Madame left the room to inspect the laundry, Leah's thoughts began to coil. Her gaze drifted to the window. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, but beyond it she imagined the path, the trees, the possibility of open air. A sudden desperate plan formed. She stood, her legs shaking under her. The workers didn't move. They watched her as if she were a figure in a silent play they'd seen too many times before. The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. Leah moved toward the hallway, her breath ragged, her pulse booming in her ears. She slipped past the doorway, her feet nearly floating across the floorboards. Reaching the front door, she hesitated. The heavy latch, the chain. Her fingers fumbled wildly, sweat slicking her palms. She managed to lift the latch and pull the door open just enough to feel the cold breath of the mountain on her face. For a heartbeat, she tasted freedom. The damp air filled her lungs and stung her eyes. Then a rough hand seized her shoulder. Leah shrieked, twisting around to see one of the elderly workers, his sunken eyes flat and resigned. He shook his head once, slow and almost sorrowful. Leah tried to break free, but he dragged her backward into the hallway. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Madame Rowe appeared almost instantly, her face white with silent fury. She didn't yell. Instead, she grabbed Leah's chin in one claw-like hand, forcing her head up until their eyes met. "You do not touch that door," Madame hissed, her voice sharp enough to slice skin. "You will learn." Without warning, she shoved Leah to the floor. Dust clouded around her face as her knees struck the boards. Madame gestured sharply, and the elderly worker moved forward, pulling Leah up by the arm. She was dragged to the laundry room and thrown down beside a pile of soiled linens. Madame pointed at the filthy floor, her jaw clenched. "All of it! Scrub until I say stop," she ordered. Leah bent her head, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her tears. Her hands moved automatically, scrubbing at stubborn stains that seemed to multiply under her fingers. Time collapsed into a blur of water, soap, and aching muscles. Every breath tasted of ash and defeat. When Madame finally dismissed her, Leah could barely stand. She returned to her room on trembling legs, the bruises on her wrists blooming like dark flowers. Alone in the cold twilight, Leah pressed the velvet pouch to her chest, her cheek against its softness. The path was still there, she told herself, beyond the fog and the locked doors. One day she would find it. That night, Leah lay awake, her body buzzing with pain and exhaustion. The moonlight barely touched the floor through the fog-thick window, turning her room into a shapeless gray box. Every small creak outside the door jolted her eyes open. She pressed the velvet pouch tighter, as if it could shield her from the cold weight pressing into her ribs. Hours dragged by until she heard it, a faint, broken whisper slipping through the hallway like a thin blade of wind. Leah rose silently, her bare feet landing softly on the rough boards. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. The voice came again, trembling, half-swallowed. "They never left. The attic, the others. She keeps them." Leah's breath stopped in her throat. She knew at once it was the pale girl. Carefully, Leah opened the door just enough to slip into the hallway. She found the girl crouched near the base of the attic stairs, her thin shoulders shaking as if she were caught in a storm only she could feel. Her lips moved rapidly, her eyes darting from the floor to the ceiling and back again. Leah knelt beside her, heart pounding so hard she thought it might echo through the walls. "What are you saying?" Leah whispered, her voice barely more than air. The girl flinched violently, her head snapping toward Leah. For the first time, their eyes met. In the girl's gaze, Leah saw a chaos deeper than fear, a well of broken things. "She keeps them in the attic. They scream," the girl choked out, her voice a torn thread. "You can't leave. She locks the night. They never come back." Leah's fingers tightened on the girl's arm, but the girl yanked away, pressing her back against the wall as though trying to sink inside it. Her mouth twisted in a silent sob, and her hands flew up to her ears. Leah heard footsteps then, steady, patient, echoing through the corridor. Madame's shadow lengthened at the end of the hall, sliding forward like an approaching tide. The girl scrambled to her feet and vanished into one of the darkened side rooms, leaving Leah alone in the hall. Leah turned, her pulse shrieking inside her. Madame stood there, her face half in shadow, the lantern in her hand spilling a thin, flickering light across the walls. Without a word, Madame raised her lantern higher, as if inspecting an insect pinned to a board. Leah felt her body freeze, every instinct screaming to run, but her legs would not obey. Madame's gaze burned through her, then slowly lowered. Her mouth twitched at one corner, a small, cold curve that was not quite a smile. She turned and disappeared back down the corridor, the lantern's glow shrinking until it vanished completely. Leah stood trembling, the girl's words rattling inside her skull. The attic, the others, they never come back. She stumbled back to her room, locking the door behind her with shaking hands. Sliding to the floor, she clutched the pouch to her chest. Tonight, the house felt more alive than ever, a living trap with its own heartbeat. Leah knew now that the hospice held more than silent rules and locked doors. It held secrets, secrets that had teeth. Leah did not sleep at all that night. Every crack in the walls, every sigh of the wind beyond the window scraped against her nerves like a blade. The girl's broken whisper replayed in her mind. The attic. They never come back. By morning, Leah's eyes burned from the darkness. Her hands trembled as she tried to smooth her hair and adjust her dress. When the door finally creaked open, Madame Rose stood there in her usual black, the lantern now replaced with a heavy iron ring of keys at her side. "Come," Madame ordered. Leah hesitated. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand, clutching the pouch beneath her dress like a talisman. Madame's gaze flickered down to her ribs, as if she could see through the cloth. They moved silently down the corridor. The elderly workers watched from the sewing room, their eyes flickering and then falling again to their hands. No one dared to follow. Madame led Leah past the kitchen, past the closed doors, to a narrow staircase that sank into the earth. The cellar door loomed ahead, a dark wooden mouth gaping open. Leah's breath caught in her throat. Madame gestured sharply. Leah stepped forward, her feet meeting cold stone steps that sucked warmth from her bones. The air turned damp and heavy. Inside the cellar, the smell hit her first. Mold, old earth, something sharper and rotting at the edges. Shapes loomed in the corners, crates, broken tools, a coil of rope on a peg. Madame stepped inside behind her, shutting the door with a thick, final thud. For a moment they stood in silence. Then Madame spoke, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You forget your place," she said slowly, each word dripping like cold water. "You think you can wander, question, resist. You believe you are different from the others." Leah shook her head weakly, her lips parting in a soundless plea. Madame's hand shot out, striking Leah across the face. The force knocked her sideways, her cheek exploding in pain as she fell to the floor. The pouch slipped from beneath her dress and tumbled into the dirt. Leah scrambled to grab it, but Madame's boot pinned her hand. "You hold on to this as if it were salvation," Madame hissed, pressing down harder. Leah gasped, her fingers burning under the pressure. "But here, nothing belongs to you. Not your voice, not your steps, not even your hope." She removed her boot and seized the pouch, dangling it in front of Leah's tear-streaked face. For a moment, Leah saw something like hunger in Madame's eyes, an almost religious delight in this small act of theft. Then Madame hurled the pouch into the corner, where it landed with a dull, soft thud. "Stay," Madame ordered, turning to leave. She locked the door behind her without another glance. Leah crawled toward the pouch, her hand trembling as she lifted it. She clutched it to her chest, rocking back and forth on the cold floor. Hours passed in the dark, each second stretching like a blade across her skin. She could hear water dripping somewhere far away. Once, she thought she heard a low moan echo through the cellar walls. When the door finally opened again, Madame stood there in the lantern light, her expression unreadable. "You will remember this," she said flatly. Leah crawled past her up the stairs on raw knees. As she reached the hallway, she felt the eyes of the workers on her again, cold, resigned, knowing. Back in her room, Leah collapsed onto the bed, curling around the pouch as if it were a dying flame. Her cheek throbbed, her bones ached, but deeper inside her, something began to shift. A slow, dangerous heat spreading through the cracks of her fear. Days passed after the cellar punishment, each hour pressing Leah deeper into herself. Her cheek still bore a faint bruise, and her knees ached from the cold stone floor. She moved silently through her tasks, her eyes lowered, her mind a dark river running beneath a thin layer of ice. Madame Rowe watched her closely now. Every stitch Leah made felt like a test, every movement weighed against some silent standard she could not see. The workers still avoided her gaze, and the pale girl seemed to have vanished completely, leaving behind an emptiness that buzzed at the edges of Leah's thoughts. One afternoon, Leah was ordered to mend a pile of old sewing baskets stacked in the corner of the workroom. She carried them to her small table, her fingers numb from hours of washing and folding. As she opened one basket, she noticed a false bottom, a thin piece of cloth poorly stitched into place. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. With shaking fingers, she peeled it back. Beneath it lay a small, battered journal, its cover worn thin and edges chewed by damp. Leah's breath stopped. She glanced around. Madame was gone for the moment, and the workers were absorbed in their quiet toil. She slipped the journal into her apron and retreated to the storage room. Her fingers trembled so violently she could barely untie the string holding the pages together. Inside, faded ink danced across the yellowed paper, the writing crooked and uneven. Her name was Emily. She arrived before me. She tried to run. They took her to the attic. She never came back. I hear her sometimes whispering through the walls. She tells me to keep quiet, but I can't. I write because it's the only voice I have left. Leah's mouth went dry. She flipped to the next page, each line cutting deeper. I don't know what she does to them up there. We all pretend not to know, but every night I hear scratching above my bed, I hear crying. I know I will be next. Her hands began to sweat, smudging the ink. Another entry appeared further down, almost frantic. If anyone finds this, don't trust her. Don't trust her promises. There is no healing here, only silence and the attic. A sudden noise in the hallway snapped her head up. Footsteps. Steady, deliberate, coming closer. Leah shoved the journal back into her apron, her breath tearing through her chest. She stepped out just as Madame Rowe entered the storage room. Their eyes met, and for a second Leah felt sure Madame could hear the frantic pounding of her heart. "Is the work finished?" Madame asked, her voice as calm as the surface of a winter lake. Leah nodded quickly, her fingers clenched tight around the apron. Madame watched her for a long, unbearable moment, then turned and left without another word. Leah sank against the wall, her knees buckling. The journal felt hot against her stomach, a burning truth pressed to her skin. She clutched it close, her mind spinning. The pale girl's whispers, the attic, the ghost names carved into silence. They all connected now, weaving a trap around her. That night in her locked room, Leah opened the journal again under the moon's faint glow. Each word felt like a nail driven into her resolve, each line a quiet scream from the ones who came before. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, the velvet pouch warm under her palm. A thought formed, sharp and trembling. She would not vanish into the attic. She would not become another whisper in these walls. The next morning arrived in a pale, trembling light. Leah dressed slowly, her fingers numb as she tied the rough fabric around her waist. The journal weighed heavily in her apron pocket, a secret heartbeat against her side. Downstairs, the workers moved like drifting ghosts, their eyes hollow and distant. Madame Rove inspected each task with her usual sharp, silent scrutiny. But today, Leah noticed something new. The woman's eyes lingered on her longer, the pauses more pointed, as if she was waiting for Leah to betray herself. After the midday meal, Leah was sent to scrub the upstairs hallway. With a pail of gray water and a stiff brush, she worked her way along the walls, each stroke echoing down the corridor. Near the end of the hall, she noticed something. Faint scratches below one of the beds. They were small, almost hidden, but unmistakable. Leaning closer, she saw letters carved shakily into the wood. Emily, the name from the journal. The name the girl had whispered through her terror. Leah felt her throat tighten, a rising wave of nausea twisting in her stomach. She ran her fingers over the grooves, imagining the broken nails, the silent desperation behind each letter. She glanced around. The hallway was empty. Slowly, she crawled further under the bed and saw additional marks. Short, frantic lines slashed into the wood like a final attempt to call for help. A noise behind her. Leah froze, her whole body rigid. She slid out, her apron catching on the frame, and turned sharply. Madame stood at the far end of the hallway, her silhouette tall and unmoving in the half-light. She held no lantern today, only the heavy ring of keys hanging from her side like a cluster of iron teeth. "What do you think you are doing?" Madame's voice was low, almost soft, but it carried an unspoken threat that scraped across Leah's bones. I dropped the brush," Leah lied, her voice a small, fragile thread. Madame tilted her head slightly, studying her. The hallway seemed to tighten around them, the air thickening like wet cloth. Without another word, Madame turned and walked away, her keys jangling like distant bells. Leah exhaled shakily, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the brush. She quickly finished her work and retreated to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. She collapsed against it, sliding to the floor. Her fingers instinctively found the journal in her pocket, gripping it like a rope above deep water. Later, in the moon's pale glow, she opened it again, rereading the frantic lines, each word now a cruel echo of Emily's final days. Leah pressed her forehead against the page, her heart stuttering with a terrible clarity. She understood now. The scratches were not just a warning. They were a grave marker, a silent tombstone hidden beneath an ordinary bed. She knew she could not stay silent much longer. Her mind, once clouded by fear, began to sharpen into something harder, something that trembled dangerously close to resolve. She hid the journal beneath her mattress, curled around the velvet pouch, and closed her eyes. Tonight, the walls no longer felt like walls. They felt like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Sleep came in fragments that night. Brief, shallow drifts into darkness, always shattered by the echo of footsteps or the whisper of wind against the window. Leah woke often, her fingers searching for the velvet pouch under her dress, her mind circling Emily's name like a wound she could not stop touching. At some point in the deep hours before dawn, she heard a soft rustling outside her door. Her eyes snapped open. She pressed herself up on her elbows, listening. A faint shadow slipped past the crack at the bottom of the door. Then a light knock, so gentle it could have been imagined. Leah's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she rose and crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. A trembling whisper came from the other side. "It's me." Leah hesitated, then carefully turned the handle. The door creaked open to reveal the pale girl, her eyes wide and glistening in the moonlight. In her thin, shaking hand, she held something small and metallic. Leah reached out instinctively, and the girl dropped the object into her palm, a small iron key, cool and heavy against her skin. The girl's lips moved soundlessly for a moment, before she forced the words out. "Gate. It opens the gate. You must go," she breathed, her voice a fragile reed in the dark. Leah looked down at the key, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would wake the whole house. "Why are you helping me?" Leah whispered. The girl's eyes darted down the hallway, her shoulders curling in on themselves like a frightened animal. I hear them," she stammered. "Every night. Emily, the others. I don't want to be next." Tears slipped down her pale cheeks as she clutched her hands to her chest, her fingers twisted together as though she was praying. Leah reached out and touched her arm, a gesture so small yet so enormous in that moment. "Come with me," Leah pleaded. The girl shook her head violently, her whole body trembling. "She'll find me. She always does," she whispered. Then she turned and fled down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness before Leah could speak again. Leah closed the door, her back sliding against it as her knees buckled. She opened her palm and stared at the key, the small glint of iron almost glowing in the dim moonlight. She pressed it to her chest beside the velvet pouch. Tonight she had something Madame Rowe did not know she possessed. For the first time since arriving, a fragile thread of hope tightened inside her, painful and bright. Her breaths came fast and shallow, as though her body did not yet trust this sudden possibility. She hid the key beneath her pillow and sat on the bed, listening to the house breathe around her. Somewhere above she imagined the attic sighing with its trapped secrets. But tonight Leah was no longer just another echo in Madame's hollow corridors. Tonight she had a way out. The hours before dawn stretched endlessly, every creak in the walls sounding sharper, every shadow on the floor crawling closer. Leah sat hunched on the edge of her bed, the iron key hidden under her pillow, the velvet pouch pressed to her ribs. When the first pale glow of morning began to seep through the window, she stood and dressed as quietly as she could. Her fingers felt clumsy, her breath ragged. She moved slowly, every motion deliberate, as if one wrong step might set the entire house howling. Downstairs, the workers drifted like silent ghosts through their morning tasks. The pale girl was nowhere to be seen, and Leah felt her absence like a sudden hole in the floor beneath her feet. Madame Rowe lingered close that day, her sharp eyes sweeping each corner, each small movement. Leah kept her head down, stitching torn linens with steady, obedient hands. But inside, her mind moved fast and hot. She traced and retraced the hallway in her head, the stairs, the entrance, the latch. She remembered each floorboard that groaned, each place she might hide if Madame appeared too suddenly. When the bell rang for midday meal, Leah ate slowly, forcing each spoonful down as though it were ash. Across the table, the elderly workers stared at nothing, their hands trembling faintly around their bowls. She scanned their faces for some sign, a hint that they might join her, or at least understand. But they looked past her, their eyes like frost-bitten glass. After the meal, she returned to the sewing room, her pulse hammering so hard she thought Madame might hear it echo through her dress. When Madame turned away to inspect a torn blanket, Leah slipped her hand under her apron and felt the cold edge of the key. That evening, she cleaned her work area meticulously, more carefully than ever before. She stacked each spool of thread, folded every scrap of cloth, and wiped the table until it shone in the dying light. As dusk began to bleed into the hallways, Madame announced curfew in her flat, iron voice. Leah followed the others upstairs, her head bowed, her body bending to the silent choreography that Madame demanded. Inside her room, she sat by the window, staring out into the fog that pressed against the glass like pale, restless hands. She held the key in one palm, the velvet pouch in the other. She reviewed her plan again and again, wait for the lantern to pass, listen for Madame's steps, avoid the loose board at the top of the stairs, slip through the front door, unlock the gate. Each step felt like a thin thread stretched over a deep chasm, but the image of Emily's name carved under the bed flared behind her eyes, steadying her resolve. As full darkness settled in, Leah curled up on the bed, clutching the pouch and key to her chest. Sleep would not come, but she closed her eyes anyway, listening for the rhythm of the house. Somewhere beyond the hallway, she thought she heard a whisper. Not the pale girl's, not Madame's, but something older, a hush from the walls themselves. Tomorrow, she told herself, her heartbeat loud and fragile in the dark. Tomorrow she would run. Night wrapped the house in a dense, suffocating stillness. Leah lay on her bed, fully clothed, every muscle taut, her breath shallow and careful. The iron key pressed into her palm so hard it left a deep mark on her skin. Hours dripped by like cold water. At last she heard it. The lantern's faint glow sliding past her door, the gentle scrape of Madame's steps on the floorboards. Leah waited, counting the seconds. When the footsteps finally faded down the far hallway, she slipped off the bed and knelt beside her mattress, retrieving the velvet pouch and sliding it beneath her dress. She pushed the key deep into her sleeve. The door creaked slightly as she opened it. Leah winced, freezing until the echo died. Then she stepped into the corridor, her bare feet silent on the boards. She crept down the hallway, past the sleeping rooms, past the portraits that watched with unblinking painted eyes. Each step felt like balancing on a blade's edge. At the stair landing, she paused. The house seemed to breathe around her, exhaling cold drafts from cracks in the walls. She started down, her hand brushing the banister lightly to keep balance. Halfway to the entrance, she saw it, a shadow moving at the bottom of the stairs. Madame stood there, lantern raised, eyes gleaming in the flickering light. The keys at her waist clinked softly like small bells of warning. Leah's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers closed around the key inside her sleeve. "Going somewhere?" Madame asked, her voice low and calm, almost gentle. Leah said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Madame. Madame stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, measured. "You thought you could leave," she whispered, tilting her head. "Did you think you were different from the others?" Leah felt something in her snap. Without thinking, she bolted down the last few steps, lunging toward the door. Madame moved in an instant, catching Leah's arm in her iron grip. The key clattered to the floor, spinning across the boards. They struggled, a violent, breathless tangle of limbs and gasps. Madame shoved Leah back against the wall. Leah kicked, her foot striking the lantern. The flame flared wildly and then burst, shards of hot oil spraying across the floor. Madame screamed, her sleeve catching fire. She flailed, trying to beat out the flames, her face twisting into something monstrous, almost inhuman. Leah stumbled forward, her eyes finding the key on the ground. She snatched it up, her fingers burning from the spilled oil. Behind her, Madame howled, her voice echoing up the stairs and down the halls like a beast's cry. The workers would hear, the whole house would awaken. Leah's heart hammered as she threw open the front door. Cold night air hit her face like a slap. She turned back one last time. Madame writhed on the floor, the fire climbing higher up her arm, her eyes locked on Leah with a final, wordless curse. Leah fled into the fog, the iron key clenched so hard it cut into her skin, the velvet pouch bouncing against her ribs with every desperate step. Tonight, there would be no more whispers, no more locked doors, only the echo of her own pulse and the path ahead, waiting. The night swallowed Leah whole as she sprinted down the crooked steps and into the dense fog. Each breath cut her lungs raw, her feet slipping over wet stones and tangled roots. Behind her the hospice groaned and crackled with muffled screams, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoing into the darkness. She clutched the velvet pouch under her dress, its small weight a burning anchor against her ribs. The iron key bit into her palm, slick with sweat and blood where it had cut her during the struggle. The fog thickened around her, so dense it seemed to crawl into her mouth and nose. She stumbled once, her knee striking a hidden rock. Pain flared, but she forced herself up, gasping, her hair whipping across her face in wet strands. In the smothering quiet of the mountains, her heartbeat roared louder than any sound. She could almost hear Madame's voice chasing her, a thin whisper curling through the mist. "You belong to me." Leah glanced back, but the fog had devoured the hospice entirely. Only a faint orange glow hinted at the fire still burning behind her. She turned forward again, pushing through a narrow path lined with gnarled bushes and black pines. At last, she saw it. The iron gate, its shape rising like a dark ribcage in the fog. Her hands trembled as she pulled the key from her sleeve, fumbling at the lock. For one agonizing moment, it stuck, the cold iron refusing her desperate shove. She forced her breath to slow, her fingers steadying. The key turned with a final shivering click. The gate creaked open just wide enough for her to slip through. Beyond it, the mountain trail dropped sharply, leading into a gray valley where the first fingers of dawn began to crawl across the horizon. Leah staggered forward, each step a battle against the dragging weight in her limbs and the numbing cold in her bones. Her mind blurred with images. Emily's name carved into wood, the pale girl's terrified eyes, Madame's burning arm twisting in the shadows. She reached a wide boulder at the edge of the trail and collapsed behind it, her body shaking uncontrollably. She pressed the pouch to her face, its velvet damp with tears and rain. Above her, the sky slowly shifted from ink to a thin, broken blue. The world around her remained silent, heavy with waiting. Leah curled into herself, the pouch clenched in her fist like a final, stubborn heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay freedom, though she had no shape for it yet, only a single truth ringing in her mind. She was alive and she had run. Dawn bled slowly across the sky, pale and indifferent. Leah lay curled behind the boulder, her breath rising in thin, ragged clouds that vanished into the morning chill. The velvet pouch rested against her lips, its soft surface damp with tears and rain. She felt every bruise, every scrape, each one proof that she was no longer trapped behind locked doors. The iron key, now useless, lay discarded beside her, its edge still stained with her blood. She forced herself to sit up, her body heavy and unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. The valley below stretched into a gray quilt of stones and brittle grass. In the distance, a thin thread of smoke rose where small settlements might still sleep, unaware of the flames devouring the hospice above. Leah pressed the pouch to her heart, feeling its quiet weight. She opened it for the first time since she arrived. Inside lay a single silver locket, its surface worn smooth. Her fingers traced its edge before she dared to open it. Inside was a faded drawing, a small portrait of a young woman with gentle eyes and a crooked smile. Written beneath in careful letters, "For Emily." A low sob crawled up Leah's throat. The girl's voice returned to her mind. They never came back, the attic, the others. She understood now. This pouch was Emily's last fragment, her last voice in a place built to erase every trace of those who had come before. Leah clutched it tighter, her tears spilling hot and silent. She stood shakily, her legs trembling. The morning wind bit through her dress, but she no longer felt its sting. Step by step, she began to descend the trail, leaving the fog and ashes behind. Each footfall echoed with memories. Madame's hissed orders, the pale girl's terrified gaze, the journal's torn pages. With every step, she felt them peel away, layer by layer, leaving behind something raw and fragile. At the first bend in the trail, Leah turned once more. The mountain loomed above her, silent and watchful. She imagined the hospice as nothing more than a blackened husk now, its walls smoldering, its secrets finally exposed to the cold morning air. Leah touched the pouch one last time and tucked it inside her dress, close to her heart. Then she faced forward and began walking again, her movements unsteady but resolute. She did not know where the path led. She did not know if she would find warmth or welcome. But she knew with every bruise and every trembling breath that she had claimed something no one could take from her again. The choice to move, to exist beyond walls, to remember. At the edge of the valley, as the first real sunlight split the fog, Leah finally allowed herself a single quiet thought. "I'm not gone. I'm not her ghost. I'm still here." And with that, she stepped forward into the light.